worst 5 meeting mistakes and how to avoid them. If you watch this video all the way to the end, I guarantee that your meetings after this point forward will be more meaningful, more productive, and will not end with people saying, oh wow, I wish this meeting was an email. I'm Chad Littlefield, let's get into it. In my work with some of the top leaders and educators around the world, I very often share my 5 essential ingredients for engagement. Virtual engagement, in person, any gathering. I've noticed these 5 ingredients that if you inject them into a meeting, it will increase meeting engagement and productivity. I've also noticed that the 5 greatest mistakes that leaders and educators make in leading meetings relate quite closely to those. We're gonna count these down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, starting at the worst practices that usually happen at the end of meetings. Number 5 is filling the time just because it's on the calendar. So often we meet for time, not for purpose, as Priya Parker says in her book, The Art of Gathering, right? Outlook, Google, whatever calendar service you use, you create a meeting and it automatically by default creates a 30-minute meeting or a 60-minute meeting. And so we meet for that amount of time, whether we need it or not. We fill up that time. We usually leave no time for self-care, especially in a remote context. We just click from link to link with hardly enough time to run to the bathroom, never mind drink any water or eat a snack. And so by the end of the day, no wonder we feel exhausted and burnt out from meetings. We haven't actually paced ourselves. We've been running 100 miles an hour, and oftentimes in an 8-hour day, it could be in 5 seemingly different or aimless directions, right? So we're like meeting for time rather than for purpose. So we're just going down this path, and then you jump to another meeting and you're like, whoa, totally different context. Woo, just jumping down this path. So the best advice that I have to avoid this mistake is be extremely deliberate with the way that you close your meetings. And so specifically, I've gone into my settings on Google Calendar and changed it so my default meetings end at 50 minutes or 25 minutes. So I've built in buffer time for that self-care, run to the bathroom, eat a snack, go breathe some fresh air. And then what I'll also often do is set a reminder or a timer to go off a few minutes, somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes before that end time. And that'll be my cue, no matter where we're at in the meeting, to lead some deliberate closing. So instead of like 3 minutes after the meeting was supposed to end, we're like, okay, what are the next steps? Quick, like, will you email me this? And blah, blah, blah. Like, you don't want to end in a frantic panic, because that's just the energy that you're sending people into their next meeting for. And so by the end of the day, everyone just feels overwhelmed. They feel like they accomplished nothing. Whereas if you create time for deliberate closing to say what needs to get done, who's going to do what, etc., you have some clear process blocked off, 3 to 5 minutes to say, how should we end this as deliberately as possible? Your meetings will get immensely better. Number 4, so often meetings are used for information rather than communication. I would love if the entire internet saw number 4 here, because if we met for communication as opposed to information exchange, we would be able to communicate information a lot faster, because human beings talk at about 150 words a minute. And so when we meet, that is the cap of how much information we can share. Whereas in an email or written video or asynchronous format, people can digest information at their own pace, at their own level, and so exchange information in a written format. Even if, like Amazon, for example, they know that if they send an email to a bunch of busy executives, it's like kind of a crapshoot whether or not they read it. And so part of the meeting culture at Amazon is everybody gets together and reads an executive brief, sometimes for up to a half hour in total silence, and then starts the meeting. So information exchange happens in written or quiet. It doesn't need to happen verbally, because oftentimes when we exchange information verbally, what happens is you'll notice people start to repeat themselves in meetings. If you've ever heard this, where someone says the same thing like a couple times and you're like, I got it, I already heard you, why are you saying that again? This is wasting time. They're saying that because they don't feel heard. So just remove that need altogether. In other words, design your content for contribution, right? So if you don't want information, but you want actually interaction and communication, and you want your meetings to be more dynamic and collaborative, design them for contribution rather than consumption. Report outs are designed for consumption, right? Sometimes people need to report things out, but I would invite you to do it with a different lens of like, we're gonna report out and then we're gonna have a 30-second, like, not fireside chat, fire speed chat. So somebody reports out, and then everybody in the chat gets 30 seconds to respond to whatever it is they said. So you get a bunch of written data out really quickly if you're meeting remotely. If you're not meeting remotely, you might have people break out real quick and just have a quick discussion about like the aha from that person's report out. Just to reflect back, just to actually process those learnings. What it does is it turns people's from consumer mode, which is like you're on the couch watching TV, and it invites people to lean in and actually use their prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that allows you to be confused and to reason and to think and to logic, right? And when people are up there, they're awake. When they're not, right, they're at high risk of tuning out, forgetting, saying this is irrelevant, maybe even ending the meeting saying, wow, this meeting should have been an email. Number 3, so often we go straight for content before any connection. Can you imagine if you and I met and I started talking to you about starting a family and having kids and what kind of house I wanted to buy before we even went on a first date? It would be really out of sequence. I think that content before connection is also really out of sequence. Peter Block once said that without relatedness, no work can occur, no real work can occur. On the flip side, instead of putting content before connection, if you spend even 1 minute or up to 7 minutes doing connection before content. And there's a really great video linked right up here, somewhere around here, on what's a good icebreaker for any meeting. So literally any context, you can do the method that I described there, the connection before content method that I described, and it'll increase the engagement of your meeting, make people lean in rather than have people tune out. Number 2, worst meeting practice, people start in a rabbit hole. It's not even that they end up there, it's that like the meeting starts with just like, you know, chit chat as people are walking in, and then that just continues and continues and continues. We actually start in a total rabbit hole, which just leads to another rabbit hole, which leads to another rabbit hole, which 60 minutes later we wondered why we saw so many rabbits and we didn't get anything done. And so the alternative to that I would offer is the ingredient of a context hook. Thinking about meetings, it's a time where people gather. They come from different places or different meetings or different times or different situations, and they come together into the same space, but nothing's actually happened to bring them into the same context other than the fact that they might have clicked a link or walked into a room, and now you're in the same context. A context hook, the idea of it is one sentence that puts everybody on the same page. What is one sentence that you could say? What is one intention that you could state that everybody could think about and say, yeah, I'm on board with that? So it might look like, by the end of this meeting, I would love to have 2 of our vendors picked out so that we can move forward on planning this conference. That's it. That's all I want to accomplish, right? By the end of it, there's a very outcome-focused intention. That seems really obvious, and that does happen sometimes in meetings, but making it a practice to like speak the language of intention and share context hooks freely. Like give them out like free lemonade. Be handing context every single meeting, like in the first 2 minutes. What's your context? What's your sentence? What's your one sentence that brings everybody together, gets everybody on the same page, puts everybody on the same team? Number 1, I do not like this. Some people don't mind as much, and it depends on your culture a little bit. Late starts, or maybe worse, aimless starts. So you got a meeting that's on the calendar for 9 a.m. and half the group shows up at 8:57, and then a couple other people show up right at 9, and then your boss shows up at 9:05. All right, it's starting late, and so typically what we do is we call that dead wasted time, and we reward people for being late by waiting for them to arrive. And the alternative that I would invite is a term from Mark Collard, a good friend in Australia, runs a company called Plamio, and it's this idea of an unofficial start. An unofficial start is don't reward people for being late, rather reward people who showed up early by starting with something immediate and purposefully engaging. So any strategy that will increase the productivity of your meeting, inspire some interaction and some engagement, that starts a few minutes before the official start time and then runs a few minutes after the official start time to extend understanding to people who are late, right? Some people have really good reasons for showing up a few minutes late, so we don't want to punish them necessarily, but we do want to start with immediate and purposeful engagement. One of the ways I'll often do that is with a question. So as people come in, I might invite them to just answer, what's one of your most important lessons that you've learned in life? Or I might change it to, what's one of your most important lessons you've learned in the last 2 weeks? Or some question to spark some conversation. Questions are like keys that unlock something inside of a person's experience. It also unlocks a whole bunch of good conversation and potential productive discussion in the beginning of a meeting. If your question connects to the purpose of why you're there, right? So ideally it's something that engages people in interaction purposefully. If you go to wean.me/5, there's a free mini video course on how to make virtual engagement easy, where I go deeper into these 5 ingredients for virtual engagement, along with some best practices, do's and don'ts of virtual and in-person meetings. I'm Chad Littlefield. Have an awesome day.